Okay, hi everyone and welcome to this video. This is your captain speaking. My name is Ross and today we are talking about active versus passive in academic writing. Now before anything else, a quick trip back to school and let's establish what we mean with active and passive sentences. So active, we mean verbs which have a subject, a verb and possibly an object, like this one here, Nature published the article. Whereas with passive, we begin with the object, then we have the verb to be, followed by a past participle, and if there's an agent of the action, that is introduced with the preposition by. Like this sentence here, the article was published by Nature. Now, the main question for this video is, should you use active or passive in academic writing? And let's throw that over to you first of all. What would you prefer to use in your own academic writing? What have you read in your field? And what have you been encouraged to do by, for example, teachers in the past? Now, from experience, I'm guessing that most of you will have given one particular answer, so my answer may somewhat shock you, because that is that, generally speaking, make the active your default setting, i.e. use the active voice unless there is a good reason not to. Now, having given this advice to many students across a number of years, I'm betting that many of you will be shocked by that. Some of you will be terrified, and definitely most of you will at least be suspicious. So, allow me to clarify that the conventions for English academic writing tend to differ from those in a lot of other languages, for example, German. So in English, you will find, if you look at the submission guidelines for journals, or if you look at writing style guides, that in almost all cases, the active voice will be encouraged rather than the passive. That doesn't mean you can never use the passive, but most style guides will tell you to use the active as much as possible. Now, just to prove to you that this is not some kind of personal agenda or opinion I'm trying to put across, I'll show you some examples from very trustworthy, renowned sources, and we'll start off with the Chicago Manual of Style, one of the most prestigious and most used style guides for academic writing across the English-speaking world. And they say, as a matter of style, passive voice is typically, though not always, inferior to the active voice. So in most cases, the passive voice is worse than the active. Then another prestigious style guide, the APA style, as we can see here, the Purdue University Online Writing Lab tells us that APA style encourages using the active voice. I'm not going to read through the rest of this quotation. If you would like to do so yourself, you can pause the recording, have a read, but the main point is that the APA also encourages the active. Then, specific publishers of journals. Here we have IEEE journals, very well renowned in many engineering fields, IT and so on, so you may have heard of it, and some IEEE guidelines here. Each type of voice has its place in writing clearly and concisely. Use the active voice by default. Research shows that readers comprehend it more quickly than the passive voice. So this goes back to what I said earlier on about making the active voice your default setting. Another famous publisher of scientific journals, Springer Journals, says use the active voice, not the passive voice, when possible. Then some specific examples from prestigious journals which are known the world over. We've got Nature, we've got Science, we've got the British Medical Journal, and we've got Reviews of Modern Physics. Now I'm not going to read through the individual quotations here. If you would like to do so yourself, you can pause the recording and have a read. But suffice to say, each of these journals encourages the active. Okay, just as a note, using active verbs does not necessarily mean writing I or we. So very often people tell me I'm not allowed to use I, I'm not allowed to use we. That's fine. If your professors tell you you can't write I or we, then you can't write I or we. There's nothing you can do about it. However, you can still write active sentences without using the personal pronouns I or we. And very often I see students who write passive sentences which are unnecessary, even though they can write an active sentence without using personal pronouns. So, as an example, the results were questioned by a Canadian research team. Here we have a passive. We can very easily change that to an active sentence. A Canadian research team questioned the results. There we have no I or we. You are a winner in terms of the active versus passive, and you have still not used any personal pronouns. Now, just before I go on, I want to draw your attention to another convention in English academic writing which often differs from those in other languages, and that is that in many cases it is perfectly acceptable and even encouraged to use personal pronouns like I or we. Now, this will tend to differ across fields in how much people use personal pronouns, but you will find as a rule that personal pronouns like I or we are viewed much more positively in the English-speaking academic writing world than they are, for example, in Germany. And I'm going to give you a quick example of this. So here we have one of the most famous scientific papers of all time, The Structure of DNA by Watson and Crick. And as you can see, this was written in 1953, so it's not even a current trend or something temporary which I'm referring to here. And you should be aware that the authors went on to be awarded the Nobel Prize after having published this paper. So they reached the very top of their scientific field. And if I have a search through their paper for the personal pronoun we, because there's two authors, we'll find it all over the place. We, and so on. So just one example there to show you that you can still write very illustrious, renowned scientific papers in the English-speaking world with personal pronouns. Okay then. Now, we've established then that the active voice is generally encouraged in English academic writing, so the next question is why? And we're now going to have a look at some of the advantages of the active. So, first of all, active sentences are just shorter and more direct, generally speaking. So if we take those two sentences from earlier on, Nature published the article is 4 words, whereas the article was published by Nature is 6 words. So in most cases, when you use the active, you immediately give your reader more work to do. Next, concrete subjects and active verbs allow the reader to visualize more easily. So we covered this in an earlier video, that concrete subjects, active verbs make sentences more interesting because readers can visualize things more and it's easier for them to grasp. So an active sentence is more likely to have an active verb, of course, and it's going to have more likely to have a concrete subject because it has a subject, whereas passive sentences do not have subjects. It helps to avoid nominalizations to use the active. So, example of an active sentence, an engine converts small explosions into movement. A possible passive, the conversion of small explosions into movement is carried out by an engine. So here we have the conversion of as the nominalization. Now, this does not mean that you're automatically going to create nominalizations if you use the passive. It's just that people tend to fall into using nominalizations more when they're writing in the passive than when they're writing in the active. Now, I mentioned before that you should use the active unless there's a good reason not to. And sometimes there are good reasons to not use the active but to use the passive. So let's have a look at some of those. The passive makes sense where the actor is unknown or unimportant. So for example, the designs have been delivered would be a pretty common standard sentence. It would be unlikely that you would write Jeff the DHL guy has delivered the designs. Even though Jeff is probably an awesome kind of a dude, he's not the important thing in this context. Another advantage is that the passive moves the object of the sentence to the front, which is good for cohesion in some cases. If you want to link up the information to the previous sentence, it might be a good idea to use the passive so you can move your object to the front. And yeah, it avoids personal pronouns like I and we, and if that's important to you. As we have established, personal pronouns like I and we are much more positively viewed in the English-speaking academic world than they are, for example, in Germany. Now, a second note is, if you are using the passive, make sure you avoid the distorted passive. Now, a distorted passive is essentially just a passive sentence with an unnecessary nominalization in it that I talked about earlier. So let's have a look at some examples here. So an active sentence: the polyurethane elastic system resists heavy impacts. There we have an active sentence. So what do you think the passive of that sentence would be? If you want to play along at home, pause the recording here, try to make the passive, and come back when you're ready. Okay then, if you've had a crack at it, let's find out the result. The passive would be: heavy impacts are resisted by the polyurethane elastic system. A distorted passive, however, would be: resistance to heavy impacts is affected by the polyurethane elastic system. So here we have resistance has been turned into a nominalization here. So I'll just put all three of those together. So as you can see, the verb resists is the active, whereas the passive is are resisted, and then the distorted passive, we have this nominalization with resistance, and we have the empty verb is affected by. So that is an example of the distorted passive, and generally you want to avoid those. Okay, that is us pretty much done for this video. Well done. As ever, if there are any questions, either shoot me an email or ask me in class. Otherwise, cheers, and I'll see you next time.